Life emerged on Earth suddenly and in complex forms. When terrestrial strata and the fossil record are examined, it is to be seen that all living organisms appeared simultaneously. The oldest stratum of the Earth in which fossils of living creatures have been found is that of the Cambrian, which has an estimated age of 500 to 550 million years. The living creatures found in the strata belonging to the Cambrian period emerged all of a sudden in the fossil record. There are no pre existing ancestors. The fossils found in Cambrian rocks belong to snails, trilobites, sponges, earthworms, jellyfish, sea hedgehogs, and other complex invertebrates. This wide mosaic of living organisms, made up of such a great number of complex creatures, emerged so suddenly that this miraculous event is referred to as the Cambrian explosion in geological literature. Most of the creatures in this layer have complex systems and advanced structures, such as eyes, gills, and circulatory systems, exactly the same as those in present day specimens. For instance, the double-lensed combed eye structure of trilobites is a wonder of creation. David Robb, a professor of geology in Harvard, Rochester, and Chicago universities, says, and quote, "The trilobites 450 million years ago used an optimal design which would require a well-trained and imaginative optical engineer to develop today." These complex invertebrates emerged suddenly and completely without having any link or any transitional form between them and the unicellular organisms, which were the only life forms on Earth prior to them. Richard Monastersky, a science journalist at Science News, one of the popular publications of evolutionist literature, states the following about the Cambrian explosion, which is a death trap for evolutionary theory. And quote, "A half billion years ago, the remarkably complex forms of animals we see today suddenly appeared. This moment, right at the start of Earth's Cambrian period, some 550 million years ago, marks the evolutionary explosion that filled the seas with the Earth's first complex creatures. The large animal phyla of today were present already in the early Cambrian, and they were as distinct from each other as they are today." Deeper investigation into the Cambrian explosion shows what a great dilemma it creates for the theory of evolution. Recent findings indicate that almost all phyla, the most basic animal divisions, emerged abruptly in the Cambrian period. An article published in Science magazine in 2001 says, and quote, "The beginning of the Cambrian period, some 545 million years ago, saw the sudden appearance in the fossil record of almost all the main types of animals, phyla, that still dominate the biota today." End quote. The same article notes that for such complex and distinct living groups to be explained according to the theory of evolution, very rich fossil beds showing a gradual developmental process should have been found. But this has not yet proved possible. End quote. This differential evolution and dispersal, too, must have required a previous history of the group for which there is no fossil record. How the Earth came to overflow with such a great number of animal species all of a sudden, and how these distinct types of species with no common ancestors could have emerged, is a question that remains unanswered by evolutionists. The Oxford University zoologist Richard Dawkins, one of the foremost advocates of evolutionist thought in the world, comments on this reality that undermines the very foundation of all the arguments he has been defending. And quote, "For example, the Cambrian strata of rocks are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there, without any evolutionary history." As Dawkins is forced to acknowledge the Cambrian explosion is strong evidence for creation because creation is the only way to explain the fully formed emergence of life on Earth. Douglas Futuyama, a prominent evolutionist biologist, admits this fact. And quote, organisms either appeared on the Earth fully developed or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed from pre-existing species by some process of modification. If they did appear in a fully developed state, they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. Darwin himself recognized the possibility of this when he wrote, "If numerous species belonging to the same genre or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection." The Cambrian period is nothing more or less than Darwin's fatal stroke. This is why the Swedish evolutionist, paleoanthropologist Stefan Bengtsson, who confesses the lack of transitional links while describing the Cambrian age, makes the following comment. "Baffling and embarrassing to Darwin, this event still dazzles us." Obviously, the fossil record indicates that living things did not evolve from primitive to the advanced forms, but instead emerged all of a sudden and in a perfect state. In short, living beings did not come into existence by evolution. They were created. Molecular comparisons deepen evolution's Cambrian impasse. Another fact that puts evolutionists into a deep quandary about the Cambrian explosion is the comparisons between different living taxa. The results of these comparisons reveal that animal taxa considered to be close relatives by evolutionists until quite recently are genetically very different, which puts the intermediate form hypothesis that only existed theoretically into an even great quandary. An article published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2000 reports that DNA analysis have displaced taxa that used to be considered intermediate forms in the past. And quote, "DNA sequence analysis dictates new interpretation of phylogenetic trees. Taxa that were once thought to represent successive grades of complexity at the base of the metazoan tree are being displaced to much higher positions inside the tree. This leaves no evolutionary intermediates and forces us to rethink the genesis of bilaterian complexity." In the same article, evolutionist writers note that some taxa which were considered intermediate between groups such as sponges, cnidarians, and ctenophores can no longer be considered as such because of new genetic findings, and that they have lost hope of constructing such evolutionary family trees. End quote. The new molecular-based phylogeny has several important implications. Foremost among them is the disappearance of intermediate taxa between sponges, cnidarians, ctenophores, and the last common ancestor of bilaterians or urbilateria. A corollary is that we have a major gap in the stem leading to the urbilateria. We have lost the hope, so common in older evolutionary reasoning, of reconstructing the morphology of the coelomate ancestor through a scenario involving successive grades of increasing complexity based on the anatomy of extant primitive lineages. Chapter 5. Tale of Transition from Water to Land. Evolutionists assume that the sea invertebrates that appear in the Cambrian stratum somehow evolved into fish in tens of millions years. However, just as Cambrian invertebrates have no ancestors, there are no transitional links indicating that an evolution occurred between these invertebrates and fish. It should be noted that invertebrates and fish have enormous structural differences. Invertebrates have their hard tissues outside their bodies, whereas fish are vertebrates that have theirs on the inside. Such an enormous evolution would have taken billions of steps to be completed, and there should be billions of transitional forms displaying them. Evolutionists have been digging fossil strata for about 140 years looking for these hypothetical forms. They have found millions of invertebrate fossils and millions of fish fossils. Yet nobody has ever been found one that is midway between them. And evolutionist paleontologist Gerald T. Todd admits a similar fact in an article titled Evolution of the Lung and the Origin of Bony Fishes. And quote, all three subdivisions of bony fishes first appear in the fossil record at approximately the same time. They are already widely divergent morphologically and are heavily armored. How did they originate? What allowed them to diverge so widely? How did they all come to have heavy armor? And why is there no trace of earlier intermediate forms? Question mark. The evolutionary scenario goes one step further and argues that fish who evolved from invertebrates then transformed into amphibians. But this scenario also lacks evidence. There is not even a single fossil verifying that a half fish, half amphibian creature has ever existed. Robert L. Roll, an evolutionary paleontologist and authority on vertebrate paleontology, is obliged to accept this. He has written in his classic work, Vertebrate Paleontology and Evolution, that, and quote, the early reptiles were very different from amphibians and their ancestors have not been found yet. In his newer book, Patterns and Processes of Vertebrate Evolution, published in 1997, he admits that, and quote, we have no intermediate fossils between Rhyphidistian fish and early amphibians. Two evolutionist paleontologists, Colbert and Morales, comment on the three basic classes of amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and caecilians. And quote, there is no evidence of any Paleozoic amphibians combining the characteristics that would be expected in a single common ancestor. The oldest known frogs, salamanders, and caecilians are very similar to their living descendants. Until about 50 years ago, evolutionists thought that such a creature indeed existed. This fish, called a coelacanth, which was estimated to be 410 million years of age, was put forward as a transitional form with a primitive lung, a developed brain, a digestive and a circulatory system ready to function on land, and even a primitive walking mechanism. These anatomical interpretations were accepted as undisputed truth among scientific circles until the end of the 1930s. The coelacanth was presented as a genuine transitional form that proved the evolutionary transition from water to land. An example invalidating evolution. Turtles. Turtle fossil aged 100 million years, no different from its modern day counterpart. The Dawn of Life, Orbis publication, London, 1972. A 45 million year old freshwater turtle fossil found in Germany. To the left are the remains of the oldest known sea turtle found in Brazil. This 110 million year old fossil is identical to specimens living today. Just as the evolutionary theory cannot explain basic classes of living things such as fish and reptiles, neither can it explain the origin of the orders within these classes. For example, turtles, which is a reptilian order, appear in the fossil record all of a sudden with their unique shells. To quote from an evolutionary source, this highly successful order is obscured by the lack of early fossils, although turtles leave more and better fossil remains than do other vertebrates. Intermediates between turtles and cotylosaurs, reptiles from which turtles supposedly sprang, are entirely lacking. Encyclopedia Britannica Online, turtle. There is no difference between the fossils of ancient turtles and the living members of the species today. Simply put, turtles have not evolved. They have always been turtles since they were created that way. Why transition from water to land is impossible. Evolutionists claim that one day a species dwelling in water somehow stepped onto land and was transformed into a land dwelling species. There are a number of obvious facts that render such a transition impossible. Number 1. Weight bearing. Sea dwelling creatures have no problem in bearing their own weight in the sea. However, most land dwelling creatures consume 40% of their energy just in carrying their bodies around. Creatures making the transition from water to land would at the same time have had to develop new muscular and skeletal systems to meet this energy need, and this could not have come about by chance mutations. Number 2, heat retention. On land, the temperature can change quickly and fluctuates over a wide range. Land dwelling creatures possess a physical mechanism that can withstand such great temperature changes. However, in the sea, the temperature changes slowly and within a narrower range. A living organism with a body system regulated according to the constant temperature of the sea would need to acquire a protective system to ensure minimum harm from the temperature change on land. It is preposterous to claim that fish acquired such a system by random mutations as soon as they stepped onto land. Number 3. Water. Essential to metabolism, water needs to be used economically due to its relative scarcity on land. For instance, the skin has to be able to permit a certain amount of water loss while also preventing excessive evaporation. That is why land dwelling creatures experience thirst, something that sea dwelling creatures do not. For this reason, the skin of sea dwelling animals is not suitable for a non aquatic habitat. Number 4. Kidneys. Sea dwelling organisms discharge waste materials, especially ammonia, by means of their aquatic environment. On land, water has to be used economically. This is why these living beings have a kidney system. Thanks to the kidneys, ammonia is stored by being converted into urea, and the minimum amount of water is used during its excretion. In addition, new systems are needed to provide the kidneys functioning. In short, in order for the passage from water to land to have occurred, living things without a kidney would have had to develop a kidney system all at once. Number 5. Respiratory system. Fish breathe by taking in oxygen dissolved in water that they pass through their gills. They cannot live more than a few minutes out of water. In order to survive on land, they would have to acquire a perfect lung system all of a sudden. It is most certainly impossible that all these dramatic physiological changes could have happened in the same organism at the same time, and all by chance. On December 22nd, 1938, a very interesting discovery was made in the Indian Ocean. A living member of the coelacanth family, previously presented as a transitional form that had become extinct 70 million years ago, was caught. The discovery of a living prototype of the coelacanth undoubtedly gave evolutionists a severe shock. The evolutionist paleontologist J.L.B. Smith said, and quote, "If I had met a dinosaur in the street, I wouldn't have been more astonished." In the years to come, 200 coelacanths were caught many times in different parts of the world. Living coelacanths revealed how far the evolutionists could go in making up their imaginary scenarios. Contrary to what had been claimed, coelacanths had neither a primitive lung nor a large brain. The organ that evolutionist researchers had proposed as a primitive lung turned out to be nothing but a lipid pouch. Furthermore, the coelacanth, which was introduced as a reptile candidate getting prepared to pass from sea to land, was in reality a fish that lived in the depths of the oceans and never approached nearer than 180 meters from the surface. Chapter 6. The Imaginary Evolution of Birds and Mammals. According to the theory of evolution, life originated and evolved in the sea, and then was transported onto land by amphibians. This evolutionary scenario also suggests that amphibians evolved into reptiles, creatures living only on land. This scenario is again implausible due to the enormous structural differences between these two classes of animals. For instance, the amphibian egg is created for developing in water, whereas the amniotic egg is created for developing on land. A step by step evolution of an amphibian is out of the question, because without a perfect and fully formed egg, it is not possible for a species to survive. Moreover, as usual, there is no evidence of transitional forms that were supposed to link amphibians with the reptiles. Evolutionist paleontologist and an authority on vertebrate paleontology, Robert L. Carroll, has to accept that. And quote, "The early reptiles were very different from amphibians, and that their ancestors could not be found yet. Yet the hopelessly doomed scenarios of the evolutionists are not over yet. There still remains the problem of making these creatures fly. Since evolutionists still believe that birds must somehow have been evolved, they assert that they were transformed from reptiles. However, none of the distinct mechanisms of birds, which have a completely different structure from land-dwelling animals, can be explained by gradual evolution. First of all, the wings, which are the exceptional traits of birds, are a great impasse for the evolutionists. One of the Turkish evolutionists, Engin Korur, confesses the impossibility of the evolution of wings." End quote. The common trait of the eyes and the wings is that they can only function if they are fully developed. In other words, a halfway developed eye cannot see. A bird with half-formed wings cannot fly. How these organs came into being has remained one of the mysteries of nature that needs to be enlightened. The question of how the perfect structure of wings came into being as a result of consecutive haphazard mutations remains completely unanswered. There is no way to explain how the front arms of a reptile could have changed into perfectly functioning wings as a result of a distortion in its genes. Moreover, just having wings is not sufficient for a land organism to fly. Land-dwelling organisms are devoid of many other structural mechanisms that birds use for flying. For example, the bones of birds are much lighter than those of land-dwelling organisms. Their lungs function in a very different way. They have a different muscular and skeletal system, and a very specialized heart circulatory system. These features are prerequisites of flying, needed at least as much as wings. All these mechanisms had to exist at the same time and all together. They could not have formed gradually by being accumulated. This is why the theory asserting that land organisms evolved into aerial organisms is completely fallacious. All of these bring another question to the mind. Even if we suppose this impossible story to be true, then why are the evolutionists unable to find any half-winged or single-winged fossils to back up their story? Spatial lungs for birds. The anatomy of birds is very different from that of reptiles, their supposed ancestors. Birds' lungs function in a totally different way from those of land-dwelling animals. Land-dwelling animals breathe in and out from the same air vessel. In birds, while the air enters into the lung from the front, it goes out from the back. Allah created this distinct system specially for birds, which need great amounts of oxygen during flight. It is impossible for such a structure to evolve from the reptile lung. Bird feathers, the structure that evolution fails to explain. The theory of evolution, which claims that birds evolved from reptiles, is unable to explain the huge differences between these two different living classes. In terms of such features as their skeleton structure, lung systems, and warm blooded metabolism, birds are very different from reptiles. Another trait that poses an insurmountable gap between birds and reptiles is the feathers of birds, which have a form entirely peculiar to them. The bodies of reptiles are covered with scales, whereas the body of birds are covered with feathers. Since evolutionists consider reptiles the ancestor of birds, they are obliged to claim that bird feathers have evolved from reptile scales. However, there is no similarity between scales and feathers. A professor of physiology and neurobiology from the University of Connecticut, A.H. Brush, accepts this reality although he is an evolutionist. And quote, every feature from gene structure and organization to development, morphogenesis and tissue organization is different in feathers and scales. Moreover, Professor Brush examines the protein structure of bird feathers and argues that is, and quote, unique among vertebrates. There is no fossil evidence to prove that bird feathers evolved from reptile scales. On the contrary, feathers appear suddenly in the fossil record as an undeniably unique character distinguishing birds, as Professor Brush states. Besides, in reptiles, no epidermal structure has yet been detected that provides an origin for bird feathers. In 1996, paleontologists made a buzz about fossils of a so-called feathered dinosaur called Sinosauropteryx. However, in 1997, it was revealed that these fossils had nothing to do with birds and that they were not avian feathers. On the other hand, when we examine bird feathers closely, we come across a very complex structure that cannot be explained by any evolutionary process. The famous ornithologist Alan Feducia states, every feature of them has aerodynamic functions. They are extremely light, have the ability to lift up which increases in lower speeds, and may return to their previous position very easily. Then he continues, I cannot really understand how an organ perfectly designed for flight may have emerged for another need at the beginning. The structure of feathers also compelled Charles Darwin to ponder them. Moreover, the perfect aesthetics of the peafool's feathers had made him sick, his own words. In a letter he wrote to Asa Gray on April 3, 1860, he said, I remember well the time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over, but I have got over this stage of complaint. And then continued, and now trifling particulars of structure often make me very uncomfortable. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Another alleged transitional form, Archaeopteryx. Evolutionists pronounce the name of one single creature in response. This is the fossil of a bird called Archaeopteryx, one of the most widely known so-called transitional forms among the very few that evolutionists still defend. Archaeopteryx, the so-called ancestor of present-day birds, according to evolutionists, lived approximately 150 million years ago. The theory holds that some small dinosaurs such as velociraptors or dromaeosaurs evolved by acquiring wings and then start to fly. Thus, Archaeopteryx is assumed to be a transitional form that branched off from its dinosaur ancestors and started to fly for the first time. However, the latest studies of Archaeopteryx fossils indicate that this creature is absolutely not a transitional form, but an extinct species of birds, having some insignificant differences from present-day birds. The thesis that Archaeopteryx was a half-bird that could not fly perfectly was popular among evolutionist circles until not long ago. The absence of a sternum breastbone in this creature was held up as the most important evidence that this bird could not fly properly. The sternum is a bone found under the thorax to which the muscles required for flight are attached. In our day, this breastbone is observed in all flying and non flying birds, and even in bats, a flying mammal which belongs to a very different family. According to evolutionists, some small dinosaurs such as velociraptors or dromaeosaurs evolved by acquiring wings and then starting to fly. Thus, Archaeopteryx is assumed to be a transitional form that branched off from its dinosaur ancestors and started to fly for the first time. This imaginary tale appears in almost all evolutionist publications. Archaeopteryx exhibits the features of a full-fledged bird. Its feathers show that it was a warm-blooded creature able to fly. Its bones are hollow like those of birds living today. Number 3, its teeth represent no evidence that it evolved from reptiles. Many toothed bird species lived in the past. Number 4, there are bird species living today that possess similar claws on their wings. Number 5, the breastbone was observed in the 7th Archaeopteryx fossil found recently. The presence of this bone shows that just like present-day birds, it possessed powerful flight muscles. However, the 7th Archaeopteryx fossil, which was found in 1992, caused great astonishment among evolutionists. The reason was that in this recently discovered fossil, the breastbone that was long assumed by evolutionists to be missing was discovered to have existed after all. This fossil was described in Nature magazine as follows. The recently discovered 7th specimen of the Archaeopteryx preserves a partial rectangular sternum, long suspected but never previously documented. This attests to its strong flight muscles. This discovery invalidated the mainstay of the claims that Archaeopteryx was a hop bird that could not fly properly. Moreover, the structure of the bird's feathers became one of the most important pieces of evidence confirming that Archaeopteryx was a flying bird in the real sense. The asymmetric feather structure of Archaeopteryx is indistinguishable from that of birds living today and indicates that it could fly perfectly well. As the eminent paleontologist Carl O. Dunbar states, because of its feathers, Archaeopteryx is distinctly to be classed as a bird. Another fact that was revealed by the structure of Archaeopteryx's feathers was its warm-blooded metabolism. As was discussed above, reptiles and dinosaurs are cold-blooded animals whose body heat fluctuates with the temperature of their environment, rather than being homeostatically regulated. A very important function of the feathers on birds is the maintenance of a constant body temperature. The fact that Archaeopteryx had feathers showed that it was a real, warm-blooded bird that needed to regulate its body heat, in contrast to dinosaurs. Speculations of evolutionists, the teeth and claws of Archaeopteryx. Two important points evolutionist biologists rely on when claiming Archaeopteryx was a transitional form are the claws on its wings and its teeth. It is true that Archaeopteryx had claws on its wings and teeth in its mouth, but these traits do not imply that the creature bore any kind of relationship to reptiles. Besides, two bird species living today, tauraco and hoatzin, have claws which allow them to hold onto branches. These creatures are fully birds with no reptilian characteristics. That is why it is completely groundless to assert that Archaeopteryx is a transitional form just because of the claws on its wings. Neither do the teeth in Archaeopteryx's beak imply that it is a transitional form. Evolutionists make a purposeful trickery by saying that these teeth are reptile characteristics, since teeth are not a typical feature of reptiles. Today, some reptiles have teeth while others do not. Moreover, Archaeopteryx is not the only bird species to possess teeth. It is true that there are no toothed birds in existence today, But when we look at the fossil record, we see that both during the time of Archaeopteryx and afterwards, and even until fairly recently, a distinct bird genus existed that could be categorized as birds with teeth. The most important point is that the tooth structure of Archaeopteryx and other birds with teeth is totally different from that of their alleged ancestors, the dinosaurs. The well-known ornithologists L.D. Martin, J.D. Stewart, and K.N. Whetstone observed that Archaeopteryx and other similar birds have teeth with flat-topped surfaces and large roots. Yet the teeth of theropod dinosaurs, the alleged ancestors of these birds, are protuberant like saws and have narrow roots. These researchers also compared the wrist bones of Archaeopteryx and their alleged ancestors, the dinosaurs, and observed no similarity between them. Studies by anatomists like S. Tarsitano, M.K.H., and A.D. Walker have revealed that some of the similarities that John Ostrom and others have seen between Archaeopteryx and dinosaurs were in reality misinterpretations. All these findings indicate that Archaeopteryx was not a transitional link, but only a bird that fell into a category that can be called toothed birds. Archaeopteryx and other bird fossils. While evolutionists have for decades been proclaiming Archaeopteryx to be the greatest evidence for their scenario concerning the evolution of birds, some recently found fossils invalidate that scenario in other respects. Lian Hai-ho and Zhongyi Zhou, two paleontologists at the Chinese Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology, discovered a new bird fossil in 1995 and named it Confuciusornis. This fossil is almost the same age as Archaeopteryx, around 140 million years, but has no teeth in its mouth. In addition, its beak and feathers share the same feature as today's birds. Confuciusornis has the same skeletal structure as present-day birds, but also has claws on its wings, just like Archaeopteryx. Another structure peculiar to birds called pygostyle, which supports the tail feathers, which was also found in Confuciusornis. In short, this fossil, which is the same age as Archaeopteryx, which was previously thought to be the earliest bird and was accepted as a semi-reptile, looks very much like a bird living today. This fact has invalidated all the evolutionists, these claiming Archaeopteryx to be the primitive ancestor of all birds. Another fossil unearthed in China caused even greater confusion. In November 1996, the existence of a 130 million year old bird named Liao Ningornis was announced in Science by L. Ho, L. D. Martin, and Alan Fiducia. Leonin gornis had a breastbone to which the muscles for flight were attached, just as in today's birds. This bird was indistinguishable from present-day birds, also in other aspects too. The only difference was the teeth in its mouth. This showed that birds with teeth did not possess the primitive structure alleged by evolutionists. This was stated in an article in Discover. Whence came the birds? This fossil suggested that it was not from dinosaur stock. Another fossil that refuted the evolutionist claims regarding Archaeopteryx was Eolulavis. The wing structure of Eolulavis, which was said to be some 25 to 30 million years younger than Archaeopteryx, was also observed in today's slow-flying birds. This proved that 120 million years ago there were birds indistinguishable from birds of today in many respects flying in the skies. These facts once more indicate for certain that neither Archaeopteryx nor other ancient birds similar to it were transitional forms. The fossils do not indicate that different bird species evolved from each other. On the contrary, the fossil record proves that today's birds and some archaic birds such as Archaeopteryx actually lived together at the same time. Some of these bird species such as Archaeopteryx and Confuciusornis have become extinct, and only some of the species that once existed have been able to survive down to the present day. In brief, several features of Archaeopteryx indicate that this creature was not a transitional form. The overall anatomy of Archaeopteryx implies stasis, not evolution. Paleontologist Robert Carroll has to admit that. End quote. The geometry of the flight feathers of Archaeopteryx is identical with that of modern flying birds, whereas non-flying birds have symmetrical feathers. The way in which the feathers are arranged on the wing also falls within the range of modern birds. According to Van Tine and Berger, the relative size and shape of the wing of Archaeopteryx are similar to that of birds that move through restricted openings in vegetation, such as gallinaceous birds, doves, woodcocks, woodpeckers, and most passerine birds. The flight feathers have been in stasis for at least 150 million years. On the other hand, the temporal paradox is one of the facts that deal the fatal blow to the evolutionist allegations about Archaeopteryx. In his books In his book Icons of Evolution, Jonathan Wells remarks that Archaeopteryx has been turned into an icon of the theory of evolution, whereas evidence clearly shows that this creature is not the primitive ancestor of birds. According to Wells, one of the indications of this is that theropod dinosaurs, the alleged ancestors of Archaeopteryx, are actually younger than Archaeopteryx. And quote, two-legged reptiles that ran along the ground and had other features one might expect in an ancestor of Archaeopteryx appear later. The imaginary bird dinosaur link. The claim of evolutionists trying to present Archaeopteryx as a transitional form is that birds have evolved from dinosaurs. However, one of the most famous ornithologists in the world, Alan Fiducia from the University of North Carolina, opposes the theory that birds are related to dinosaurs. Despite the fact that he is an evolutionist himself, Fiducia has this to say regarding the thesis of reptile-bird evolution. Well, I have studied bird skulls for 25 years and I don't see any similarities whatsoever. I just don't see it. The theropod origins of birds, in my opinion, will be the greatest embarrassment of paleontology of the 20th century. Larry Martin, a specialist on earlier birds from the University of Kansas, also opposes the theory that birds are descended from dinosaurs. Discussing the contradiction that evolution falls into on the subject, he states, to tell the truth, if I had to support the dinosaur origin of birds with those characters, I'd be embarrassed every time I had to get up and talk about it. To sum up, the scenario of the evolution of birds, erected solely on the basis of Archaeopteryx, is nothing more than a product of the prejudices and wishful thinking of evolutionists. The origin of mammals. As we have stated before, the theory of evolution proposes that some imaginary creatures that came out of the sea turned into reptiles, and that birds evolved from reptiles. According to the same scenario, reptiles are the ancestors not only of birds but also of mammals. However, there are great differences between these two classes. Mammals are warm-blooded animals. This means they can generate their own heat and maintain it at a steady level. They give birth, they suckle their young, and their bodies are covered in fur or hair. Reptiles, on the other hand, are cold-blooded. They cannot generate heat, and their body temperature changes according to the external temperature. They lay eggs. They do not suckle their young, and their bodies are covered in scales. One example of the structural barriers between reptiles and mammals is their jaw structure. Mammal jaws consist of only one mandibular bone containing the teeth. In reptiles, there are 3 little bones on both sides of the mandible. Another basic difference is that all mammals have 3 bones in their middle ear: hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Reptiles have but a single bone in the middle ear. Evolutionists claim that the reptile jaw and middle ear gradually developed into the mammal jaw and ear. The question of how an ear with a single bone evolved into one with 3 bones, and how the sense of hearing kept on functioning in the meantime, can never be explained. Not surprisingly, not one single fossil linking reptiles and mammals has been found. This is why evolutionist science writer Roger Levin was forced to say, the transition to the first mammal, which probably happened in just 1 or at most 2 lineages, is still an enigma. Evolutionists propose that all mammal species evolved from a common ancestor. However, there are great differences between various mammal species such as bears, whales, mice, and bats. Each of these living beings possesses specific systems. For example, bats are created with a very sensitive sonar system that helps them find the way in darkness. These complex systems, which modern technology can only imitate, could not possibly have emerged as a result of chance coincidence. The fossil record also demonstrates that birds came into being in their present perfect state all of a sudden and that they have not undergone any evolutionary process. A bat, a bat fossil aged 50 million years, no different from its present day counterpart. George Gaylord Simpson, one of the most popular evolutionary authorities and a founder of the neo Darwinist theory, makes the following comment regarding this perplexing difficulty for evolutionists. The most puzzling event in the history of life on Earth is the change from the Mesozoic, the age of reptiles, to the age of mammals. It is as if the curtain were rung down suddenly on the stage where all the leading roles were taken by reptiles, especially dinosaurs, in great numbers and bewildering variety, and rose again immediately to reveal the same setting, but an entirely new cast, a cast in which the dinosaurs do not appear at all. Other reptiles are supernumeraries, and all the leading parts are played by mammals of sorts barely hinted at in the preceding acts. Furthermore, when mammals suddenly made their appearance, they were already very different from each other. Such dissimilar animals as bats, horses, mice, whales are all mammals, and they all emerged during the same geological period. Establishing an evolutionary relationship among them is impossible, even by the broadest stretch of the imagination. The evolutionist zoologist or Eric Lombard makes this point in an article that appeared in the leading journal Evolution. Those searching for specific information useful in constructing phylogenies of mammalian taxa will be disappointed. All of these demonstrate that all living beings appeared on Earth suddenly and fully formed, without any evolutionary process. This is concrete evidence of the fact that they were created. Evolutionists, however, try to interpret the fact that living species came into existence in a particular order as an indication of evolution. Yet, the sequence by which living things emerged is the order of creation, since it is not possible to speak of an evolutionary process. With a superior and flawless creation, oceans and the lands were filled with living things and finally man was created. Contrary to the ape-man story that is imposed on the masses with intense media propaganda, man also emerged on earth suddenly and fully formed. The myth of horse evolution. Until recently, an imaginary sequence supposedly showing the evolution of the horse was advanced as a principal fossil evidence for the theory of evolution. Today, however, many evolutionists themselves frankly admit that the scenario of horse evolution is bankrupt. In 1980, a 4-day symposium was held at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, with 150 evolutionists in attendance to discuss the problems with gradualistic evolutionary theory. In addressing the meeting, evolutionist Boyce Rensberger noted that the scenario of the evolution of the horse has no foundation in the fossil record, and that no evolutionary process has been observed that would account for the gradual evolution of horses. The popularly told example of horse evolution, suggesting a gradual sequence of changes from four-toed, fox-sized creatures living nearly 50 million years ago to today's much larger one-toed horse, has long been known to be wrong. Instead of gradual change, fossils of each intermediate species appear fully distinct, persist unchanged, and then become extinct. Transitional forms are unknown. Dr. Niles Eldridge said the following about the evolution of the horse. There have been an awful lot of stories, some more imaginative than others, about what the nature of that history of life really is. The most famous example still on exhibit downstairs is the exhibit on horse evolution prepared perhaps 50 years ago. That has been presented as a literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now I think that is lamentable, particularly when the people who propose those kinds of stories may themselves be aware of the speculative nature of some of that stuff. Then, what is the basis for the scenario of the evolution of the horse? This scenario was formulated by means of the deceitful charts advised by the sequential arrangement of fossils of distinct species that lived at vastly different periods in India, South Africa, North America, and Europe solely in accordance with the rich power of evolutionists' imaginations. More than 20 charts of the evolution of the horse, which by the way are totally different from each other, have been proposed by various researchers. Thus, it is obvious that evolutionists may have reached no common agreement on these family trees. The only common feature in these arrangements is the belief that a dog-sized creature called Eohippus, which lived in the Eocene period 55 million years ago, was the ancestor of the horse, Equus. Yet Eohippus, portrayed as an equine ancestor that became extinct millions of years ago, is almost identical to the mammal known as Hyrax that still lives in Africa, but has not the slightest connection with horses. The invalidity of the claim regarding the evolution of the horse is becoming clearer every day with the discovery of new fossils. Eohippus has been identified in strata containing some fossilized breeds of horse, Equus nevadensis and Equus occidentalis, that are still alive today. Equus nevadensis, this shows that the present day horse lived at the same time as its supposed forebear, proving that the horse never underwent the process of known as evolution. The evolutionist science writer Gordon R. Taylor explains this little acknowledged truth in his book, The Great Evolution Mystery. But perhaps the most serious weakness of Darwinism is the failure of paleontologists to find convincing phylogenies or sequences of organisms demonstrating major evolutionary change. The horse is often cited as not only fully worked out example, but the fact is that the line from Eohippus to Equus is very erratic. It's alleged to show a continual increase in size, but the truth is that some variants were smaller than Eohippus, not larger. Specimens from different sources can be brought together in a convincing looking sequence, but there is no evidence that they were actually ranged in this order in time. All these facts are strong evidence that the charts of horse evolution, which are presented as one of the most solid pieces of evidence for Darwinism, are nothing but fantastic and implausible tales. Chapter 7: Evolutionists' Biased and Deceptive Fossil Interpretations.